The worst part isn't that my son stole $63,000 from me while I was recovering from cancer. The worst part is that some nights, I still miss him enough to almost call him. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. There's actually a box in the back of my closet right now that I haven't opened in almost 2 years because I'm afraid of what it'll do to me emotionally. And that sounds ridiculous until I tell you what's inside. Birthday cards. Mother's Day cards. Little notes he wrote me when he was a kid. One of them says, "You're the one person I know will always love me no matter what." And I can't decide anymore if reading that would destroy me or comfort me. Maybe both. I don't know. I really don't know anymore. I've been trying to figure out where the story starts, and honestly, I think that's part of why it's taken me this long to talk about it at all. Because there's no clean beginning. No obvious moment where alarms started going off. It was smaller than that. Quieter. Just little things I noticed over the years and explained away because when it's your child, your brain protects them automatically. Even from your own instincts. Especially from your own instincts. And I need you to understand something before I keep going, because otherwise none of this will make sense. I love my son completely. The kind of love that clouds judgment. The kind that edits reality a little without you realizing you're doing it. His name is Tyler. He's 26 now. And I haven't spoken to him in, God, almost 2 years. Sometimes I still catch myself thinking about texting him. That's the humiliating part nobody prepares you for. You think betrayal kills attachment instantly, but it doesn't. Not when it's your kid. Your body still remembers them before your mind catches up. I'll see his favorite cereal at the grocery store, and for half a second I still think, Tyler liked those. Then it all comes back again. Every time. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage thyroid cancer. Very treatable. That's what the doctors kept saying. But when somebody says the word cancer out loud, your brain doesn't really process the hopeful part immediately. At least mine didn't. I remember sitting in my car afterward gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers hurt. And the first person I called was Tyler. Not my sister Carol. Not my friends. Tyler. He answered on the second ring. That detail matters to me now in a way it didn't then. Because before that, he'd been distant for a while. Busy all the time. New apartment. New job. He worked in finance. Investments or wealth management or something along those lines, and honestly every time he explained it to me, I get lost after about 30 seconds. But he sounded successful, confident, like he'd finally become stable. And I wanted that for him, so badly, maybe too badly. So when he answered immediately, and I told him about the diagnosis, he didn't hesitate, not even for a second. He just said, "Mom, I'm on my way." And I started crying right there in the parking lot. I remember thinking, this is who he really is. That thought has haunted me ever since. Because now I replay that moment constantly wondering, did he mean it? Or did he hear vulnerability? I hate that my brain even asks that now. I hate what this has turned me into sometimes. Tyler came over that same night carrying groceries and flowers that honestly looked like he bought them from a gas station on the drive there. And weirdly, that made them sweeter to me. It felt rushed, urgent, like he genuinely needed to get to me, quickly. He made soup while I sat at the kitchen table crying harder than I meant to. At one point I kept apologizing for crying and he said, "Mom, stop apologizing." And he sounded sincere. That's what makes the story so hard to explain. If he'd been cold or obviously manipulative, maybe I could understand it better now. But he wasn't. He remembered how I take my tea. He sat beside me during appointments. One night, he drove 40 minutes at almost midnight because I mentioned over the phone that I was scared to sleep alone after reading something online about complications. Who does that if none of it is real? See, I still do this. I still defend him. Even now. God. About 3 weeks after my diagnosis, my sister Carol came to stay with me during treatment. Carol has always been sharper than me about people. Less sentimental. More observant. And one afternoon after Tyler left my house, she looked at me and said, "Tyler seems stressed lately." I immediately said, "Well, obviously. I have cancer." And she did this little shrug. "Yeah," she said. "Maybe." That was it. 2 words. But something about the way she said them sat wrong with me immediately. Not enough to confront. Not enough to question. Just enough that I still remember it perfectly now. And what I didn't understand then, what I really should have paid attention to, was that Carol had been quietly afraid of something about Tyler for years. Carol and Tyler always had this tension between them. Not fighting exactly, nothing dramatic, but there was something underneath every interaction that never fully relaxed. And I used to think it was because Carol was too hard on him, too suspicious, too willing to assume the worst in people. Now I'm not so sure. When Tyler was around 17, there was this Thanksgiving dinner where everybody ended up irritated with each other by the end of the night. You know how families get sometimes. And after everyone else went outside, Carol stopped me in the kitchen. She said, "You need to be careful with him." I actually laughed. I remember wiping dishes with a towel and saying, "Careful of what? He's a teenager." And she got very quiet before saying this one word I never forgot. Slippery. That was her word for him. Slippery. I got defensive immediately. Angry, honestly. Because what does that even mean when you're talking about a kid? I told her she was being unfair, judgmental, that Tyler was going through normal teenage issues, and she was acting like he was dangerous somehow. She backed off after that, at least outwardly. But now I replay that conversation all the time. Because the truth is, even back then, there were moments that didn't quite add up. Tiny lies about stupid things. Stories that shifted slightly depending on who he was talking to. Teachers who seemed strangely exhausted during conferences. And every single time I explained it away. Because that's what parents do when they love their children and don't want to believe the harder version of reality. You adjust the frame instead of questioning the picture. A few weeks into treatment, Tyler asked if he could move back in temporarily. That part matters to me. It was his idea. He said, "Mom, let me actually be there for you." And hearing that, God, I can still feel what that did to me, emotionally. Because every parent secretly wonders if their child will show up when life becomes ugly. When things become inconvenient and frightening and real. And in that moment, I thought, he's choosing me. I cried right there in the kitchen. Actually cried. And Tyler hugged me and kept saying, "You're not doing this alone." He moved into the guest room 2 days later. And honestly, for a while, it felt wonderful having him there. I know that complicates the story, but it's true. There were mornings he'd already have coffee made before I came downstairs. He drove me to appointments without complaining once. Sat beside me in waiting rooms for hours scrolling through his phone but constantly checking if I needed water or a blanket or anything. One night I got sick around 3 a.m. after treatment and found him asleep on the downstairs couch because he said he wanted to keep an ear out in case I needed help. How am I supposed to process that now? Seriously, how do you place that version of somebody beside what came later? I still don't know. We started talking more during those months than we had in years. Long late-night conversations at the kitchen table after dinner. Sometimes we'd sit there until midnight just talking. About work, life, his future, mine. He talked constantly about finance and investments and clients and opportunities, and honestly most of it went over my head. But he sounded confident, successful, like somebody who'd finally figured adulthood out. And I was proud of him. That's another thing I'm ashamed to admit now. I was so proud. Every time he said, "I'm doing really well financially now, Mom," I felt relief physically leave my body, like years of worrying about him were finally ending. Looking back, I wonder if he knew exactly how badly I needed to believe that. One evening over dinner, Tyler started asking questions about my house and retirement plans. Nothing alarming. At least not then. He asked what I originally paid for the house, whether I'd ever considered downsizing eventually, what my long-term plans were financially, normal adult conversations, responsible conversations, and honestly, there was a part of me that felt impressed by it, like he was becoming thoughtful and mature and stable. So I answered everything openly. Of course I did. He was my son. But there were moments. God, there were moments. One night, maybe 6 weeks into him staying with me, I woke up around 2 a.m. and heard him downstairs on the phone. That wasn't unusual. Tyler had always been a night owl. But his tone immediately made me uneasy. Tight. Controlled. The same voice he used as a teenager whenever he was trying to explain away trouble at school. I couldn't hear exact words, but I could hear pressure in the rhythm of the conversation. Deflection. Tension. I actually sat up in bed, put my feet on the floor. For a second I almost went downstairs. And then I stopped myself because I thought, Don't be paranoid. He's probably dealing with work stress. So I lay back down. I still think about that moment constantly. Because now I wonder, if I'd walked downstairs that night, what would I have seen? Would I have understood sooner? Or was I already too late without realizing it? About a month into his stay, Tyler asked if he could help organize my finances while I focused on treatment. He framed it gently, reasonably. Mom, you're exhausted right now. Let me just help make sure everything's organized. And honestly, it sounded loving, responsible. He was literally standing there making soup while we talked about it. Soup! That detail wrecks me for some reason. Because betrayal is supposed to look ugly. It's supposed to feel obvious while it's happening. Not warm kitchens and homemade soup and your son reminding you to take medication. But I said yes. Immediately. No hesitation. I gave him access to my banking accounts, my investment account, everything. And what I didn't realize then, what I couldn't possibly understand yet, was that decision had already changed the course of my entire life. I need to explain something about treatment before I tell you what happened next. Because people hear early-stage cancer and assume it wasn't that serious emotionally. But fear doesn't really work in stages. Your body changes. Your routines change. Every strange ache suddenly feels important. And even when doctors are optimistic, part of your brain quietly starts preparing for terrible possibilities anyway. I was exhausted constantly. Not just physically, mentally. Some days I'd stare at simple paperwork like it was written in another language. And Tyler stepped into all of that so naturally that I barely noticed how dependent I'd become on him. He organized bills, helped sort insurance paperwork, set reminders for medications. Sometimes he'd sit beside me on the couch with my laptop open and say things like, "I cleaned up some account settings for you." And I just nod because honestly, my brain was fried half the time. And I trusted him completely. That's the sentence I keep coming back to. Completely. Not cautiously. Not partially. Completely. There was one afternoon that keeps replaying in my head now. I came downstairs unexpectedly, while Tyler was working on his laptop at the kitchen table, and the second he saw me, he snapped it shut. Fast. Too fast. It startled me enough that I actually laughed. I said, "What are you hiding?" "Porn." And for half a second, literally half a second, he froze before smiling. Then he rolled his eyes and said, "Jesus, Mom." And I laughed too. I let it go immediately. Because what was I supposed to think? That my son was stealing from me while helping me through cancer treatment? My brain couldn't even form that possibility yet. That's what I mean when I say love edits reality. You don't consciously ignore warning signs. Your mind just keeps translating them into safer explanations automatically. Treatment ended in March. Clear scans. Good prognosis. Relief. I remember crying in the car afterward while Tyler drove us home. Not sad crying, just release. Months of fear finally draining out of me all at once. Tyler squeezed my hand at a red light and said, "See? I told you you'd be okay." And I believed him. That night we ordered takeout and drank cheap champagne in the kitchen. Carol came over too, and for the first time in months, everything felt normal again. Hopeful even. I remember looking around the room thinking, we made it through. Cancer behind me. My son close to me again. Life finally stabilizing. And honestly, that memory still hurts more than some of the uglier ones. Because happiness feels cruel when you realize it existed beside betrayal the whole time. About 2 weeks later, Tyler told me he'd found an apartment and was ready to move back out. I was genuinely happy for him. Proud even. I teased him about abandoning his poor recovering mother now that she was healthy again, and he laughed and hugged me. Everything felt normal. That's the part one need people to understand. There was no dramatic shift. No obvious crack in the mask. No moment where I suddenly saw some hidden monster underneath my child. Tuesday morning, he packed his car while I stood in the driveway holding coffee. And before he left, he hugged me for a long time. Longer than usual. Then he looked directly at me and said, "I love you, Mom." Clear. Steady. Certain. I said it back immediately. Of course I did. Then he drove away. And I remember standing there afterward, feeling this tiny, strange emptiness in the house. Not fear exactly. Just quiet. Too much quiet. That afternoon, I sat down to finally go through my finances properly for the first time in months. I'd been avoiding it during treatment because I was exhausted and honestly afraid of seeing how much medical bills had piled up. I made tea, opened my laptop, and within maybe 3 minutes, my life split into before and after. I noticed the investment account first. The account my husband left me when he died. Something about the numbers looked wrong immediately. Not emotionally wrong at first, visually wrong. Too many transactions. Too much activity. I actually remember squinting at the screen because I thought maybe I was misreading it somehow. Then I started counting account accesses. 47 logins over 4 months. 47. I counted twice because I genuinely thought I had to be misunderstanding what I was looking at. Then I saw the balance. $63,000 missing. I can still feel what happened in my body in that exact moment. My hands went cold first. Then my ears started ringing. I just sat there staring at the screen whispering, "No, no, no, no." And here's the part I'm still ashamed of. My first thought wasn't Tyler. It wasn't. My first thought was bank error. System glitch. Fraud from some random stranger. Literally anything except my son. Because once you allow that possibility into your mind, my child did this, you can't put it back. Some part of me understood that instantly. So my brain fought it. Hard. I started opening transaction records one by one. Wire transfers. Multiple transfers. All sent to an account name I didn't recognize. I remember trying to say the name out loud, hoping maybe hearing it would trigger recognition somehow. Nothing. Panic started climbing into my throat. I called the bank shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. The woman on the line walked me through everything calmly while I sat there barely breathing. Then she asked, "Did you authorize another user on the account?" And I said, "My son had viewing access." There was this long pause. Then she said carefully, "Viewing access alone wouldn't allow wire transfers." I gripped the edge of the kitchen table, so hard my fingers cramped. "What does that mean?" Another pause. "It means the permissions were expanded at some point." Expanded. Such a clean little word for something that destroyed me. I remember sliding slowly from the kitchen chair onto the floor because suddenly I couldn't stay upright anymore. And even then, even sitting there shaking on the kitchen floor, I was still trying not to believe what was becoming obvious, until I finally picked up my phone, called Tyler, and heard him answer on the second ring again. He answered so normally. That's what still gets me. No hesitation, no panic, just, "Hey, Mom," like any ordinary phone call. And for this tiny, pathetic second, I actually thought maybe everything really was some misunderstanding. Maybe he'd explain it in 30 seconds, and I'd feel ridiculous for panicking. I wanted that so badly. God, I wanted that. Instead, I said, "Tyler, I need you to tell me what happened with my account." And then there was silence. Not confusion, not shock, just silence. Heavy silence. The kind where your body starts understanding the truth before your brain fully catches up. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my hand hurt. And then he said, "Mom, I was going to tell you." That sentence changed something inside me permanently. Because right then, before he explained anything else, I knew. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding. My son had stolen from me, and somewhere deep down, he'd already accepted that reality long before I had. I kept waiting for him to correct himself somehow, to backtrack, to say, "No, wait, that sounded wrong." But he didn't. Instead, he started explaining things very quickly. Too quickly. Like parts of a story had already been rehearsed in his head. He said he'd gotten involved in a business deal that went bad. Said he owed money to people he shouldn't have borrowed from. Said things spiraled faster than he expected. Then he said the thing I still hear in my sleep sometimes. "I knew you wouldn't willingly give me that much money." Willingly. That word destroyed me more than I can explain. Because it meant he understood exactly what he was doing. He understood consent. Understood I would say no. Understood he had to go around me instead of through me. That isn't desperation. That's calculation. And hearing your own child speak with that kind of cold awareness, I can't fully describe what it does to your brain. It feels like suddenly realizing there's been a locked door inside someone you love your entire life, and you never even noticed it was there. I asked him how much he planned to pay back. Not if. How much? That's how deep denial still was in me. Part of me was still trying to rescue some version of him emotionally. And immediately he said, "All of it. That was always the plan." Like intention somehow softened reality. I started pacing the kitchen, then, because suddenly sitting still felt impossible. And I said, "Tyler, I had cancer." Silence. "You were living in my house while I was sick." Silence again. "I trusted you." Finally he whispered, "I know." Just that. I know. No breakdown. No sobbing apology. Just acknowledgement. And honestly, that calmness scared me more than yelling would have. Because I kept waiting for him to sound horrified by what he'd done. Panicked. Ashamed. Instead, he mostly sounded exhausted. Like somebody relieved a secret had finally surfaced. And that realization made me physically cold. I hung up eventually. I don't even remember deciding to. One second the phone was against my ear, the next it wasn't. Then I just stood there in my kitchen staring at the wall while my whole body shook. People always ask if I was angry. And yes, eventually, absolutely. But first I felt cold, completely hollowed out. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat on the couch for hours, replaying every moment from those months. The soup, the appointments, the late-night conversations, his hand squeezing mine after treatment. And this horrible question kept repeating in my head over and over. When did he decide to do it? Before he moved in? After? Did he comfort me while already planning it? Or did something change later? I still don't know which answer hurts less. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, lawyers, and humiliation. And yes, humiliation. Nobody talks enough about how humiliating betrayal feels. I had to explain to banks and investigators that yes, my adult son had access to my accounts. Yes, I trusted him completely. Yes, I allowed him into every part of my financial life voluntarily. Every conversation made me feel smaller somehow. Like I had failed some basic intelligence test everybody else understood naturally. There were nights I barely slept because I kept replaying tiny moments in my head searching for clues I missed. One night I actually found myself crying over a stupid memory of Tyler borrowing $20 from me in high school and forgetting to repay it. $20. I sat there at 2 in the morning wondering if that had been a warning sign too. That's what betrayal does. It turns your entire history into evidence. Carol came over almost every day during that period. At first she avoided saying, "I told you so." And to her credit, she never actually said those words. But I could feel them sitting silently in the room anyway. Then one night after too much wine, I finally asked her, "How long have you thought something was wrong with him?" She stared at her glass for a long time before answering. "Years." That word hit me like a slap. Years. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And she looked genuinely heartbroken when she answered, "Because you would have defended him." And the awful part, she was right. I would have. Completely. About 6 weeks later, I ran into Jason's mother at the grocery store. Jason had been Tyler's best friend growing up, practically lived at our house for years. Then suddenly, around age 20, they stopped speaking entirely. Tyler told me they drifted apart. I believed him immediately. Of course I did. So when his mother saw me in the cereal aisle and her expression changed the second I mentioned Tyler's name, my stomach dropped instantly. Because it wasn't surprise on her face. It was pity. Deep pity. Then she quietly said, "I heard what happened." And in that moment, before she even explained further, I realized this wasn't the first time my son had betrayed someone who trusted him. Not even close. I hired a financial investigator 3 days after that grocery store conversation. Even now, saying that out loud feels unreal. A financial investigator. Like I was living in someone else's life and just temporarily borrowing it. Because part of me still wanted this to be small. Limited. A mistake with boundaries I could understand. Something I could categorize emotionally and eventually put away. But I needed certainty. Not comfort. Certainty. So I called a woman named Denise. And I remember sitting across from her in a quiet office, watching her take notes while I kept trying to minimize everything. I might be overreacting. I just want clarity. I don't know if there's even more here. And Denise eventually stopped writing, looked at me directly, and said, very calmly, "People don't usually do this kind of thing accidentally." That sentence landed hard, because it removed the last comfortable explanation I had left. Accident. Desperation. One-time mistake. Gone. The investigation took about 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks felt like living inside a slow collapse. Every few days, Denise would call with updates. And every update removed another layer of denial I didn't even realize I was still holding on to. At first it was just my accounts. Then patterns started emerging. Then names. Then history. And what she described wasn't random. It was structured, controlled, repeatable. She told me something I'll never forget. He's very good at identifying trust. Not wealth. Not intelligence. Trust. People who emotionally opened easily. People who wanted to believe the best in him. People who already cared about him before he asked for anything. That was the pattern. And hearing my son described like that, like some kind of emotional strategist, I actually felt sick. Physically sick. Denise explained that what I was seeing in my account wasn't isolated. It was part of a longer pattern that stretched back years. 6 years, at least. 6 years. I remember repeating it out loud because my brain refused to accept it. 6 years. And she just nodded. There were other people involved. Friends. Co-workers. Roommates. Even older acquaintances who had helped him financially during temporary emergencies. Each story had a slightly different shape, but the structure was always the same. Urgency. Emotional connection. Trust already established. Then money. And then confusion afterward when things didn't add up. What scared me most wasn't even the pattern itself. It was the adaptation. Because Denise said something that stayed with me. He adjusts his approach depending on the person. That means awareness. That means strategy. That means learning. And I remember whispering, "How does someone become like that?" And she said, "Usually gradually." Gradually. That word again. Slow erosion instead of sudden change. And that terrified me more than anything else. Because it meant there was no single moment I could point to and say, that's when he became someone else. At some point during those meetings, Denise asked about timing. Specifically whether anything unusual had happened in Tyler's behavior before my diagnosis. And suddenly I remembered something I had completely dismissed at the time. 8 months before I got sick, Tyler became extremely interested in my financial planning. At the time, it felt responsible, even flattering. He started talking about estate organization, inheritance structure, legal planning. He sent me articles, spoke in detail about protecting assets. And then he recommended an attorney, a very specific one, someone he said he knew through work, professional, reliable, experienced with financial clients. I remember feeling proud of him then, like he was finally becoming the kind of adult who understood responsibility. So I went, and I brought Tyler with me, because he understood the details better. I can still see him sitting beside me in that office, calm, collected, listening carefully, while my future was being discussed like a simple administrative process, and I signed documents I didn't fully understand, because I trusted him, completely. After everything collapsed, my own attorney reviewed those changes, and the tone of his voice changed halfway through reading them. Not dramatic, just serious, carefully serious, and he told me something that still sits in my chest like a stone. Those revisions were not straightforward. There were complications, potential irregularities, and ongoing legal questions about how and why certain changes were made. I can't go into details because it's still being sorted out legally, but what I can say is this. That moment in the attorney's office with Tyler sitting beside me may not have been as innocent as I believed at the time, and I still don't know whether he was simply guiding me or quietly steering me. That uncertainty is something I live with every day. After that, I started doing something I didn't realize I was doing at first. I started rewatching my own memories like evidence, not emotionally, structurally, looking for inconsistencies, patterns, clues. And that's when the most disturbing realization hit me. There wasn't one moment where everything changed. There were hundreds of small ones I ignored, because they were too small to matter individually. But together, they built something I didn't recognize until it was already fully formed. One night Carol said something I didn't expect. We were sitting in my living room surrounded by paperwork, and she said quietly, "You always saw him as safe first." I thought she was blaming me again, but then she added, "I used to envy that." That made me stop, because suddenly this wasn't about stupidity or blindness. It was about how love works, the way it filters information, softens edges, protects itself from truths it can't emotionally carry. And I realized something I didn't want to admit. I didn't miss the signs because I was careless. I missed them because I couldn't afford to see them. And once that truth finally settled in, I got a call from Tyler that I didn't expect at all. A call that would force me to confront the one question I still couldn't answer. It was just after midnight when Tyler called. I remember because I was still awake on the couch with the television playing something I wasn't really watching. One of those nights where you leave noise on just so the house doesn't feel completely empty. When his name appeared on my phone, I actually froze. Tyler. I hadn't seen his name on my screen like that in months. Everything since the confrontation had been lawyers, emails, documented conversations, controlled, distant, careful. So seeing his name again, it did something to me physically. My chest tightened immediately, and for a few seconds, I just stared at it. Part of me wanted to let it ring out. Part of me wanted to answer immediately just to hear his voice again. And I hate that both of those things were true at the same time. I answered. The first thing I heard was his breathing. Uneven, shaky, like he'd been crying before he called. And my body reacted before my mind did. That instinct, that old mother instinct that never fully shuts off no matter what happens. Tyler, I said, and there was a pause. Then he whispered, Mom, I'm sorry. Just that. Not a performance. Not dramatic. Just exhausted. And hearing his voice like that hit me in a place I wasn't prepared for. Because I was still angry. But I was also still his mother. And those two things don't cancel each other out the way people think they should. He started talking. Said he knew apology didn't fix anything. Said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. Said he'd started therapy recently and was trying to understand himself better. And I remember sitting there thinking how small that sounded compared to what had happened. Therapy. Understanding. Words like that feel almost too gentle after something that large breaks your life open. I didn't interrupt him. I just listened. And eventually I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest for months. The real question. Not about money. Not about logistics. About meaning. I said, when you were here, during my treatment, when you were taking me to appointments and sitting with me in waiting rooms. My voice actually broke halfway through and I had to stop. Then I continued. Was any of that real? There was silence. Long silence. So long I thought the call had dropped. And in that silence, I felt something I didn't expect. Hope. Even after everything, part of me still wanted him to say yes in a way that made it simple again. But life doesn't give simple answers after something like this. Finally he said, yes, just that. And I closed my eyes immediately because that answer hurt in a completely different way. Because it meant the betrayal didn't erase everything. It meant both things existed at once. Love and harm inside the same person. And I didn't know how to hold that. I still don't. I asked him, how am I supposed to believe anything you say now? And this is the part where he finally didn't sound rehearsed. He sounded lost. I don't know, he said. I don't know how to prove it to you anymore. And I believe that part. Not everything. But that part. Because once trust is gone, even truth becomes contaminated. That's what nobody warns you about. You don't just lose trust in the person. You lose trust in your ability to interpret reality. I told him he needed real help. Not surface-level help. Not quick fixes. Real help. Because by then I had read enough, seen enough, heard enough from Denise that I understood something I didn't want to understand. This wasn't just a financial situation anymore. This was a pattern of behavior that had to be addressed at a deeper level than apologies or legal consequences. And he didn't argue. He just said, okay, quietly, like he already knew, and that somehow made it worse. When the call ended, I just sat there for a long time without moving, and I realized something that scared me. The anger wasn't the strongest feeling anymore. It was grief. Not grief like someone died. Grief like something fundamental inside me had been removed and replaced with uncertainty. Because I wasn't just grieving what he did. I was grieving the version of him I thought I knew. The version I built my life around without even realizing it. And the most painful part is this. That version still exists in my memory. Unchanged. 8 years old in the backyard during a summer storm, standing in the rain with his arms out like he was trying to absorb the world. That child feels untouched. Clean. And I refuse to let go of that memory. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone else. It barely makes sense to me. Now there's a box in my closet. Still there. Still unopened. full of cards and drawings and letters from every version of him I once believed in. Sometimes I stand in front of it and just stare at it like it might explain something if I open it at the right time. But I haven't opened it yet, because I don't know what I'll feel when I read those words now. Love, or manipulation, or both. And I think that's the part that breaks me the most. Not knowing which version of my own past is safe to hold on to. People ask me sometimes if I've forgiven him. I never know how to answer that, because forgiveness feels like something you do after understanding. And I don't understand this yet. I'm still in it, still trying to make sense of what was real and what wasn't, and whether those two things can even be separated anymore. Some days I miss him so much it feels physical. Other days I can barely think about him without shaking. And most days, I just live somewhere in between those two extremes. Functioning, breathing, continuing. I survived cancer. I survived discovering the truth. I survived the nights after, when I lay awake replaying every moment trying to figure out where I missed it. And maybe that's the only conclusion I have right now. Not closure, not forgiveness, just this. I'm still here, still standing in my house, still trying to decide whether I can open a box in my closet. Maybe this weekend. Maybe not. I don't know yet, but I'm still here.